So welcome everybody, and it is so good to see so many familiar faces and some new faces on our on this Zoom call today. Bit of background, my name is Deborah Taras. I'm the Principal Youth Work Specialist for the National Youth Agency, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you all here today and to be working alongside Roy Smith, who is going to be taking our in conversation. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I think Roy needs to really introduce that, but I do just want to say a massive thank you, Roy, for for working in partnership with us, and I'm really looking forward to the next hour of conversation. So I'm going to pass it across to yourself.
All right, thank you very much, Deborah. That's great, and again, really pleased to see some familiar faces there. People I've known for quite a while, and some people I've met more recently. I'll do a brief introduction to me, and then going to get on with things. As Deborah said, it's going to be a mix of some discussion-based stuff. I'm going to do a little bit of presentation, which is going to be going through the research I'm doing at the moment, some of the stuff that's out there in the literature about young people's politics and participation, and also what I'm going to be doing about it, essentially. So, as an introduction, my name's Roy Smith, as I've said. I'm currently doing PhD-based research at the University of Huddersfield, which is a bit of a travel for me because I'm down in Medway. So at the moment, virtual work is pretty much what that looks like. I'm doing that part-time, and that research is very much around young people's politics and participation. And that, as you'll see, will link to various different things. My other side of my role is I'm also the operations manager for Medway Council Youth Service, and have a background over the last 20 years in youth work management and detached youth work particularly, which I think very much where my perspective comes on into participation is around my experiences of detached and street-based work, which has a strong influence on, I think, virtually everything I do in terms of youth work, but particularly in terms of my views on participation and how we work around that. So I'm going to start by sharing a presentation. The first bit of it is going to be a little bit about some of the introductory research that's in the area, and I'm just going to hope I'm using Teams right. I'm used to using this, but I'm usually on Teams, so excuse myself there, and I'll just share this up. And is that sharing okay, Deborah?
Yes, it is perfect.
Brilliant. So the project is called Experience, Express, Enact. And the idea is a participatory inquiry into young people's democratic socialisation, which is a bit of a mouthful, but generally it's around how young people both learn and do participation as young people and as young adults, and how they move through that. And the reason it's a participatory inquiry, that does mean I have got some core questions around that, but I'm also quite interested in seeing where this inquiry takes us. I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean by participatory research, because I think it's something that if youth workers aren't aware of, should be more aware of, because it fits very closely with our practice. I'm going to start off with some key themes around this. And first off, really talking about going back to Putnam in 2001, there's been a traditional view, I would say, that you hear quite a lot, and it's the kind of rote understanding about young people and politics, is that young people aren't engaged as they were, or that particularly from the 60s onwards, there's a decline in engagement of young people in politics and civic life. And what we're talking about here is young people not joining unions, political parties, groups, being less likely to be part of that. And Putnam's writing in 2001, but I think that's a familiar refrain that we would hear, that young people aren't as interested or less engaged than they were previously. I would say I don't necessarily think that's true. And I think there's a lot to say to challenge that and be critical of Putnam there. But what I would say is it starts off that when we start thinking about youth participation, there is a trap that we can very easily fall into, the deficit thinking that sees young people as part of a problem or problematic somehow. And certainly that idea that younger people are less engaged in politics or not interested in politics is part of that. More modern research seems to suggest that young people's participation perhaps has moved away from things like political parties and unions and more collectivist approaches, and has become a little bit more individualistic, certainly around single issue topics. Sometimes young people gathering, getting interested in particularly, say, work around the environment, or previously around things like stopping war protests, but perhaps not joining political parties and getting involved so much in that way. And Bang spoke about everyday makers and this tendency to separate the idea of political concern from electoral politics and voting. And what we're seeing in some ways is people expressing their political opinions more through their actions and their everyday lives than perhaps in voting or political parties. And I think there's a challenge there for us as a society when we think about that, to think about what that does in terms of people who are politically engaged being potentially very different and very at odds with the people who are meant to represent them on a structural political level. It's going to sound a little bit far from youth work, but it kind of sets the scene for where I'm talking about. And when we start thinking about whether people are engaged or aren't engaged in politics, one of the things that will come about is people start thinking, well, what does get people engaged? What is it that leads people to be interested or involved in political activity or involved in changing the world around them? And I use that as a bit of a catch-all term, and you'll notice I move between some of the things that are around political activity and stuff that's to do with local community activity, because I think they're intrinsically linked. Some people might disagree with me, but I do think there's an intrinsic link with the idea that you might want to try and have an influence in whether that's services, organisations you're involved in, or the country you live in, or the world you live in. And one of the biggest influences that I think comes through in all of the research is around family and the projection of family values and behaviours, the modelling that people see within their family home, having perhaps the biggest influence on young people. One of the risks when we look at that is we think that that means one thing, that people will turn out like their parents and will always follow their parents' route, which we know is not the case. But there is a significant amount of evidence that suggests that on the whole, people tend to follow what their parents are doing, or to have very similar political values and beliefs in them en masse to their parents and communities. However, a lot of people argue it's a bit more complicated than that, that peers have more influence on young people particularly, but also the idea that Flanagan talks about in a really good book from 2013 that is around mini polities. And what she's talking about there is young people developing their political identity through all the groups that they meet, the different young people they get involved in, their class at school. It could be a church group that they're involved in, could be a youth club, could be different spaces they move between, forming that political opinion that might have come initially from a parental starting point, but will develop and shape throughout their lives in terms of who the other people they mix with. What she says is that the similarities between parental and young people's political views are more to do with their relationships with the political systems that they live within. So there is a tendency that sometimes noticed that young people are likely to support the political systems that they grow up in. And we obviously see examples of where that's not the case. But I think the generalised systems, rather than the left or right political parties, tend to be supported because it's what people know and what people are comfortable with. Although obviously there's a big array of difference from there. In terms of democratic education, again, one of the reactions to this idea that young people might be deficient or might have a lack of political education has been different moves to try and improve or involve young people in democratic education, to try and support moves to try and get young people more involved. I'm somewhat cautious of that because I do think it comes from a deficit place sometimes, where we assume that young people aren't involved already, which I think sometimes is the case. But some of the things that were identified that supported young people were that if they had a level of high levels of self-efficacy or belief in their ability to influence change in the world around them, whether that be in small ways, just being able to negotiate with their parents, or being able to have influence in terms of their classroom at school, and young people believing that their actions matter, can have a big influence on whether young people will engage or work in terms of political systems and other community systems around them. One of the most effective teaching, one of the things that was looked at is you'll sometimes hear that there's a call out for greater work around instructional work around political literacy. And I do think there's a place for that and an importance. However, there is a wariness that there's very little evidence that instructing young people in the systems around politics, purely sitting down and formal education that tells people what the tells people about the nature of politics and its processes, has any real effect. So that, it can give people a grounding, but it doesn't necessarily impact on their likelihood of voting or participating or getting involved in politics. What was seen to have some impact were things like open classrooms, practical measures, activities, things like youth councils, youth forums, being involved in campaigns. So young people's early experiences of being involved in work that tries to influence change has an impact on their likelihood of being involved throughout their life course. And I think that's quite interesting. I think one of the things that jumped out to me is one of the biggest predictors of people voting and people involved in electoral politics is that they have voted before. So that sense of past experience having a really shaping effect on how people move on and go through. There was also some evidence that written and verbal skills have a big impact. So the school activities that impact on likelihood of voting and likelihood of being involved in politics being sometimes linked with those written and verbal skills that help people navigate and understand the politics around them. And this gets us on to, I think, where we start seeing youth work and where youth work starts to come into this to a degree. And there's this sense that being part of multiple voluntary groups, having these diverse networks where you meet lots of different people to you and are starting to move between different social groups, having a formative effect on people's political identity, understanding of the world around them, their attitudes and empathy for other people. And Quintilia here in 2008 study showed that the more of those voluntary groups that people were involved in, whether that was a football club, the Scouts, a youth club, an after-school music group, that the more groups and the more diverse those groups were, the greater the chance of a young person feeling confident being able to involve themselves in politics. And I think that's a real, to us, something we should hold on to and think about what is our role there as youth workers. There's also quite a lot of stuff around adult allies. The sense of when you look at young activists' biographies, there's a lot of talk around the role that adults, whether that be a youth worker or a teacher or an activist in a community, has had in terms of supporting a young person. And as Fulham says there, some of that is around mentoring and support and education, but some of it is around really simple things, just about the resource and giving young people access, bringing young people into a space where they might be able to have conversations with other people or learn about it. It could be around a teacher who runs a session on climate change. It could be around a project that's done in a youth club. It could be around young people being accompanied to a climate protest, as you see there. And getting more into youth work, there's a sense there that Tony Jeffson 2018 is writing about that roots of youth work in rational thinking and freedom and autonomy, the links that we have intrinsically in the genesis of youth work around democratic education. And there's some things in there around the early clubs and the sense of being a member of a club. I don't think we look at this enough when we talk about the history of youth work, but a lot of other people have written about it far more competently than I can talk about. But the early youth clubs, the idea of a member was certainly something that was around. You had a role in that organisation. You were someone who had a say and had an influence in terms of what that organisation looked like. And I do wonder if sometimes that's lost its way a little bit. Certainly when we talk to young people who are members of youth clubs and youth projects, I think it's worth us questioning, do the young people see themselves as members of an organisation that is involving shaping that organisation and developing it? Or do they see themselves as customers who come in through the door and pay maybe 50p to come to a youth club? And I wonder how much that has shifted. Bernard Davies there talking about the rise of managerialism, outcome focuses, and that neoliberalism word that I raise here, that sense of shifting that sense away from democratic education, reducing the space for that, as young people are seen as problems, and in terms of the problems they present by some of the systems. And that's been fought against by youth workers for a long time. But certainly there's a sense that the agendas and the funding around youth work move towards problems that are perceived around young people, whether that's around teenage pregnancy, whether that's around youth violence, whether that's around young people not voting, could be an example, young people not participating. When we treat young people as a problem, we tend to forget that sense of democratic practice because the curriculum is already made up for us. Our ideas about what we're going to be doing and how we're going to be working together are somewhat preset there. And Tony Taylor and a few other people wrote about that, moving on to that sense of political education, being the initial intention, but moving forward to an idea that when we talk about participation now, to what degree are we talking about political education, and to what degree are we talking about that sense of youth-proofing government policy, that idea of youth work as a way of organisational improvement? And I think the quote there about narrowing the input of young entrepreneurs, selling themselves as the voice of young people, which is a bit of a bleak outlook on that. And I'd like to be a bit more hopeful than perhaps is presented there, because I do think there is room within youth work and space within youth work for democratic education. And I see it through what we do. I don't think we always recognise that it's democratic education that we're doing. And I think it's something that I part of what the conversation I want to start today is talking around that and our role in terms of democratic education as youth workers. And so for the first bit of group work, I'm conscious with the group that we've got here of 40 people, which is fantastic to see, if slightly nerve-wracking, is to try and get you into some groups where you can have a bit of a conversation for about 5 or 6 minutes. And the first bit I'd like to get you thinking about is about the youth workers' role in terms of political and participation and democratic education. So I'd like you to think about what you think the role of the youth worker is in young people's political participation and democratic education. And when we come back, I'm going to ask you just to see if there's anyone who's got anything they'd particularly like to share. I won't go around every group because we'll be here all day. I'm sure everyone's got a lot to say, but there's going to be other ways that people can get involved in this later on as I get into talking about the meat of the project. So Deborah, if we could send people off to groups, that'd be great.
Okay, so I'm going to open up the rooms now. Please go in, and I've got it set for 5 minutes, Roy, so everybody will automatically get kicked out after 5 minutes, which is going to be hard for a group of young youth workers to only talk for 5 minutes. So here you go, folks.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you've been able to have a bit of a conversation there. And I know 5 minutes isn't very long. We've got an hour here together. And I just thought I'd like to invite out a few comments from some of those conversations. Did anyone have anything in their groups that they'd like to share with everybody in terms of their thoughts around the role of the youth worker in participation and democracy?
Can I speak, Roy? Is that all right? Sorry, I've done loads of speaking. And I was thinking, is the last bit being recorded? Because I did swear in that last bit. So sorry about that. That's all right then. Yeah, just thinking
you're
about.
All right, Jane.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That's one of the colleagues said about it shouldn't be just about participation. It should really be about ownership. And I thought that was a really, really good point, thinking about, we encourage young people to participate. And sometimes that does come from a deficit position. We want you to participate because we need this set of outcomes. But actually, if you really owned it, then we wouldn't even be encouraging participation because that would happen kind of organically. And also thinking about where some of us are positioned in terms of our, where we sit. Some of us are sort of put in, we sat with social care with a statutory, with a big statutory element. And actually, young people's participation in that is actually quite tricky because we're supposed to fit the system to the young person, not the young person to the system, but that doesn't actually happen. But what everyone sort of said, we only had 5 minutes, is everyone has a real appetite for this and doesn't see, really wants this to kind of happen and be, real part of embedded in what we do every day.
I think it's something me and Kev were talking about while we were in the break. We were saying that there's a sense that certainly that there's been a decline in the political nature of the youth work, and that's certainly what a lot of the literature says. Yeah. But we were asking ourselves the question, has it declined, or has it just been that it's always been isolated examples or smaller examples of people who were radically involved in politics and were very bold about that? And because we've got less youth workers or less organisations involved in youth work than perhaps historically, we're seeing less of it. So there's this sense of looking back with rose. We've got to be careful about looking back with rose-tinted spectacles sometimes, I think.
Roy, you've got 3 people with hands up. Yeah, if you can see it, all right.
Thomas, hello, nice to see you, Thomas.
Hello, nice to see you again as well. So hi everyone, my name's Thomas. I have a background in youth council stuff, and I also worked in NCS. So I suppose I counted as a youth worker for a bit, but not anymore. So there's 2 comments I think were really good in our discussion. The first was from me about being the role of a youth worker is to really be a facilitator. So I think it's really important that young people aren't being told how it is, but it's about letting them find out for themselves how it is. So I always remember it was never our youth worker, telling us how to go about something. She should of course guide us, but it was very much we were being empowered. And Terry picked up on it as well. It was it's very important to work with young people. So there's an equity relationship. So it's important to feel like equals and that they are empowered to work alongside youth workers. So they are confident in taking decisions, if that makes sense. Hopefully there was some useful comments there.
No, absolutely. And we're going to get on to looking at some of that sense of what role the youth worker plays in that. that sense of being side by side with the young person is on their journey. Certainly any of the achievements that young people are making should be their own achievements. And, you know, whether that's, you know, getting their voice heard in a community organisation or politically on a national level, the youth workers' role, I think that facilitator thing is really important. I've got Simon and then Natasha.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm just making the point in our group around the fact that it doesn't matter whether you live in a city, town, village, rural community, there's huge decisions always being made about your community and who makes those decisions, etc. Be it in terms of planning applications. I can think of my own community at the minute in terms of how young people are not involved in that process very often, in terms of either understanding why decisions are being made the way they are and how young people can actually get involved in influencing those sorts of things that happen, in particularly around future of housing developments, what the town looks like in the future, etc. All those sorts of different things, which is not necessarily always you know, on a major party political thing, but it's a very important thing in terms of community and civic life. And the other thing that was mentioned in our group as well was around commissioning processes, that very often it's a case of that commissioners don't always appear still to this day actually have any real consultation with young people about the delivery of that service. And again, unfortunately, it feels very often it's around how do we fit young people into a particular service, or rather than young people influencing the development of that service. And it goes into that thing of, you know, how, you know, the financial constraints and things on how I suppose, like, how neoliberalism's impacted the world we live in terms of cutting back on services all the time, rather than young people actually saying, well, hang on a minute, I don't even agree with this at all.
And I think absolutely, I'll pick up what you said there, Simon, about the role youth workers play, and I mentioned it earlier, in that of giving young people access to those decisions, because the reality is we get called on it quite a few times around, have you got we've got a decision that needs to be made around the community, and that a lot of young people we work with won't necessarily have a natural route into that decision-making process, and sometimes we're there signposting and enabling young people to get into a position where their voice can be heard. So it's not about, you know, necessarily educating young people how to do it. Sometimes it's about physically putting young people in that space. And yes, Natasha.
Yeah, my connection's not great, so hopefully you can hear me okay. But good. So yeah, with us it's very similar around providing an open space to explore ideas. And also one of the points that came up, which was really interesting, about is it best to support young people in being politically neutral, because there can be a lot of fear about
We've lost you there, Natasha, slightly.
I think our bandwidth's just gone.
You get some amazing sound expressions with us.
You did.
Maybe we'll come back to that, Natasha. I can't quite hear you. But I think you were talking about political neutrality, and if we're being neutral as youth workers, whether you know, what service that always does to young people, and that sort of links with what Thomas was saying there, and it's going to come up as a theme in the next section that I'm going to be talking around. This idea that is that have I got you right then, Natasha?
Yeah, sorry, my sound's back now. Yeah, so yeah, looking at whether we're also encouraging young people to be politically neutral, because it can be maybe is it not very healthy to kind of say to young people, well, you shouldn't be saying that, or we can't discuss that subject, and then encouraging everyone to be politically neutral might then not create a healthy space for young people to then debate.
Absolutely. I mean, there's an interesting thing that when I was talking about families, one of the things I didn't mention was that one of the combinations in families that led to the most politically engaged young people was where a young person grew up with one parent who had strong political views and the other parent had strong opposing political views, yet they resolved them in a positive way. And what it was found was that when what the young person was doing was observing their parents arguing and resolving their political differences, and that actually had a really strong politicizing effect on young people, which I think is quite interesting. I think one of the things that I'm going to talk about later a little bit is that the political neutrality which we adopt as youth workers is sometimes risky. This idea that that a lot of people, whether it's a youth worker or a teacher, that we always have to be completely neutral, I think is somewhat problematic. I think, and I'll get into that. I'm not going to go too much into it now because I'm going to go a bit into it later. So I'm just going to pick up from my presentation. So, and I'm going to go back to start talking a little bit about the research I'm actually doing and what I'm doing about this, because that's kind of why I'm here, and we'll get into it here. So, okay, is this working now?
Yeah,
okay.
It is. Yeah.
So the research that I'm doing is a participatory action research project. And if people aren't familiar with that, it's a form of research. Traditional research would be a researcher comes out, asks people what they think, says, thank you, that's very interesting. And we'll write that up and then communicate that in a big essay somewhere. Now, I'm probably going to have to do that because I'm at a university. So I recognize I'm still going to have to write something up at the end of this. But the idea of a participative action research is that it's co-owned by the people who are working on that research. So the people who I'm obviously going to be leading and coordinating some part of that research, but the people involved in it have got a say in can share their views. They can help with collecting data. They can reshape perhaps some of the focus on what we're going to be looking at. Think about they can be involved in some of the decision making, about how we evaluate some of the data, and also about how we promote the research. My research will have failed, in my view, is if all I do at the end of this PhD is produce a book that goes on a shelf somewhere and is read by me and a supervisor. To me, that would have been not worth doing. The reason I'm doing participatory action research is because I'm a youth worker and I want to try and influence how we work with young people around politics and participation. And I'd like to work with people who are also interested in doing that. And that's very much the methodology I'm trying to adopt here. That is made both easier and more difficult by being online. I can reach more people and talk to people from all over the place using these online calls. But as all of you will have experienced over lockdown, your ability to be fully participatory in a online group and online chat is, I think, somewhat impaired sometimes. So the model we're working on at the moment, I'm very much in the middle of all this. I'm very early doors in some of the field work, and I've delivered a few interviews, and I've been involved in, I've delivered a couple of workshops that we've worked with people from across the country, and I can see a couple of people like Terry are here today who were involved in some of the first ones that we've done. And the group work sessions discuss some of those issues that we're talking around in terms of politics and youth participation. And at the moment, I'm in a process of reflecting on some of the initial discussions that people have had, some of the concerns people have got and interests people have got, where we start making some sense of it. I'm going to be doing a little bit more of that, and I'm hoping to see whether any of you might be interested in getting involved in some of these in the future. The next step will be to pick particular issues and concerns that come out of this research, and then work with small groups around that over a period of time, trying things out, coming up with new ideas, thinking up ways of working. And if this sounds familiar to youth work, it should do, because this is a youth work process. That sense of doing something, seeing what we think about it, having a chat about it, reflecting, and then trying to do something different at the end of it. And my hope is at the end of this, we come up with some ideas and tools that can be used by youth workers, that can inform practice, and not just youth workers, it could be informing teachers, other organisations, in terms of what does good participation look like? What does good political participation look like? Here's some stuff that has come out of those conversations. So part of the group work that I've been doing has been talking about how participants talk about their roles and what people say about it. And here are some of the key things that came out for me, and inclusivity being a key theme. I love that quote. I can't remember who said it off the top of my head, but it's not that young people don't want to engage, it's that we haven't found a way of engaging them yet. And I think that comes out a lot with when people start using the words like hard to reach, by which I think usually we should be referring to young people not as hard to reach, but as we've either forgotten about or easy to ignore, as I think I heard someone once say. But the idea of participation needing to be inclusive and to go beyond the everyday groups. And I think certainly when I've talked about inclusivity with people, there are some concerns in some places that young people don't feel that all participation opportunities are for them. And I think that's where some of the detached work ideology comes into me, of thinking about going out and working with people where they're at, rather than always expecting young people to come to us. As you can see there, that theme around neutrality versus indoctrination. We're very concerned about young people being indoctrinated by adults, and I think sometimes over concerned. The thing I would say on it is that there's a tendency to think we can't share our political views because a young person might adopt it. I've been doing youth work for 20 years, and if I thought a young person would just do something because I thought it or said it, I'd be very surprised, because most young people have got very strong views and opinions of their own. That said, I think there does need to be guards in place in terms of youth workers or anyone working with young people trying to over-influence them in one way or the other. What I don't think that should exclude is people being able to own their own political thoughts and opinions. And I think that's the thing I was talking about there, that sense of people modelling and actually saying, well, you know, that's what I believe. And I think we do this around a lot of subjects, but in terms of when we talk about this neutrality, we're neutral about certain things, but there's certain things we don't feel the need to be neutral about. So, for example, I don't think youth workers necessarily feel the need to be neutral about racism. We don't feel the need to be neutral about our feeling that young people should be involved in decision making. But all of these have got political dimensions. A lot of what we do as youth workers have got some political dimensions, and I think the things we feel less comfortable on are when we're challenging official power. Certainly the power of our employees, as I think me and Kev were talking about earlier, the sense that young people will end up challenging the people who employ the youth workers if they're given enough time to do that. I think there's a thing there about how we as organisations, and particularly when we're working with organisations, prevent them from being so brittle as to be worried about young people challenging them. And it comes on to that sense of that role that we have as youth workers in terms of support and challenge. When we're working with young people, we are there in terms of supporting them, but we're also there to ask questions, to get people to reflect on their views. I think the phrase I used to use as a detached youth worker would be that I'm not there to tell a young person what to think, but I am there to make sure that they have thought about what they're going to do, and they've thought about their thoughts, and have to promote that sense of reflection. There's a big strand around making it count, around youth voice that is meaningful, that isn't just consultation, that isn't just a tokenistic step there, that where young people are asked because they have to be asked and nothing really happens with it. So there's a sense of wanting to make sure young people's voice actually means something and does something. And there's also this bit around opening doors and creating spaces in the role, that where we take young people to a new experience. And one of the things that was talked about in one of the groups, I think it was the one that I think someone here attended it, about the importance of international work and international experiences in helping young people grow and understand what other cultures are like, what it's like in a different place, what different political systems are like. I think a big part of the learning and the effective learning around democratic involvement is around people having past experiences that they can draw on and learning from their own experiences. So when we're creating an environment where young people can be involved in discussions, where they can have a chance to change and influence the world, that has a great impact on their, again, self-efficacy and confidence to do that again. And then one of the other bits was, and some of this duplicates, so I'm not going to go over all of these, but a bit around what makes young people more or less likely to participate. And again, there were some very key reoccurring themes about the subject being relevant. Is the thing that they're being asked to participate on, or are the subjects available for them to participate in relevant to them and their experience? Does it connect to them and their lives? And that being a really important bit. And again, I go back to detached youth work and say, start where young people are already at, what young people's interested in. Politics builds from our connection with our community and then builds all the way up to connections with local and national politics and government. But if we start with a point that is disconnected from a young person, it's not going to be meaningful. I've said about meaningfulness, and I think that comes in inclusivity. That sense of adult support and understanding the value and benefit of adult allies, what we do when we are beside young people working with them. There is a sense of political literacy and understanding of processes. I need to check in a little bit on there's an all-party political group on at the moment that is looking at political literacy, and it's something I need to check in on a bit more. I'm less interested in the instructional elements, but I do think there is an importance to it. I don't think enough adults understand our political system, if I'm totally honest, let alone young people. And that is obviously going to impact on our ability to act as competent educators sometimes. The impact of people's previous experiences. Have people had positive or negative experiences of being involved and participating? And also that safety, the relative safety of sharing. How do people feel about sharing things about their lives? Is it going to have an impact on ostracizing them in their community, put them at risk of around employment or other things? So there are some of the key themes. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to get you back into groups now. And this time I'm going to ask you to think about some examples of how young people have been encouraged and put off political participation. So examples that you can think of from your experience of where young people have been encouraged and supported and felt like, yeah, this is for me. I'm going to get involved. I want to have a voice in the community, and examples of where people have been put off and things that have put people off. So I'm just going to do that for another 5 minutes.
5 minutes, Roy? Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, guys, you should be getting it now. Inviting you to join.
Hi, okay. To try and keep within time, what I'm going to do is I want you to hold on to the discussions in your group to the end, and I'm just going to share a few more bits with you. Sorry, I just realised not everyone was back. I'm going to share a few. Wow, watching the screen go is quite fun. Yeah. Okay. As we're a little bit short on time, what I'm going to do is share the last few slides and hold on to some of the ideas you had at the moment, and then we'll bring those back into a discussion at the end. Before I do, one of the things I want to share with you is about how to get involved in the study, and I'm sharing it now in case anyone needs to go early. So I'm just putting in the chat. What I'm putting in the chat is an online consent form, which is for people who'd like to take part in this study or get involved in some way. And the information sheet can be downloaded from it. I know there's a couple of people who've already been involved, which is great. I'm really interested in talking to more people, talking to young people that you're working with if you're interested in that as well, and you've got young people who'd be interested in engaging. If you complete the online consent form, then it will prompt me to then invite you to future workshops and try and facilitate where we can perhaps get into some of the subject in a little bit more of an in-depth way. So I'm just going to go back to the presentation. Where's my share thing? Oh, there is. Okay. And then we'll have a bit more of a conversation. So some of the things that came out of this in terms of people's experiences, and these are just direct quotes from some of the research participants. So about how young people are influenced by their family and peers. You've got that sense of the family thinking they're posh now. You know, a young person who's taken a political journey and then almost been maybe not ostracized, but been mocked by their family for having ideas above their station, came through as a risk. The idea of celebrity influence, and obviously we know about social media being a big part of that. Young people talking about doing it for the gram. The idea of, you know, whatever our thoughts about that, there's an idea about social media has increased people's awareness of perhaps certain issues and ability to communicate, but also there's a lot of risks associated with that around the commodification of it, around how meaningful some of that involvement is. There was a lovely bit here about a role model in the community who young people saw. He was an activist in the community and identified with him and saw him as a leading voice. And also about people realizing about shared goals. And I think one of the interesting things is that we tend to think about, especially when on that deficit idea of thinking about how we impact on young people. And I think it's really important that we get into thinking also about how young people affect other people. I love the idea that young people's passion inspires us as jaded adults sometimes. When we see a young person take on a political view, and you wonder that's possibly why people like Greta Thunberg get embraced so quickly, because actually as adults we see a young person who is taking the lead there and showing leadership in some sense. Again, we can go into criticism of that, but that probably isn't the time for that now. Challenging those stereotypes that we have that go back to well, pre-society, if we're honest. We know the deficit ideas of young people go back to well beyond Socrates, so I won't bore with that one at the moment. And we know that if our sessions really excite and influence young people, the chances are that that's going to influence how their families work, the conversations back in the family. So this is a two-way street. Some really interesting stuff there about waking up professionals and actually change happening. And then the bit that's important for the next stage of the study is what participants had questions about. Again, on the right there's that warning there about deficit thinking, around us thinking that, well, if young people don't vote or don't involve or don't participate in whatever way that we're talking about there, that they're somehow wrong or bad. Well, actually, most adults don't involve themselves politically, and we could see voting as a very lazy form of participation in many ways if we only do it for every 4 years or so. 4 or 5 years or so. You know, actually being involved in your community and being involved in politics is hard, continuous work. And we're often expecting some of the people who've got an awful lot on their plate, as it already is, to do an awful lot of work there. And we need to recognise that when we're talking about young people's participation. But there is a sense of getting more young people involved. How do we make the work that they're doing meaningful? What do we do when we're supporting young people, when we're alongside them, to be that ally who's going to try and make sure that they're not taken advantage of by people who just want to consult with them all the time. And I think we all know about consultation fatigue at the moment. We'll have heard a lot of that around young people. There's a sense there of whose responsibility. Primarily, I've been talking to participation workers at the moment, and there was a feeling from some of them that sometimes the idea of youth voice and participation, because it's in their role, sits just with them, which is disappointing as a detached youth worker. From in my background, I would see participation as a fundamental part of what I did in terms of working with young people to get their voices heard in their community, to support them to campaign on issues that mattered to them. And that sense that some youth workers, particularly as we were talking about earlier, as we focus on issues of need that could be around youth violence and crime, which I think can draw people into some of those deficit narratives that see young people in terms of their problems, we focus solely on that and actually perhaps sometimes forget that importance of getting young people heard in a political and democratic process that could be really vital to what they're doing. And again, that we talked about that idea of international work. The big thing that came out of it that I think was appreciated by the people who did join me on some of the initial workshops has been around being part of a community of practice, having a chance to share resources and information. And what I'd like to do now, I was going to go into another bit of group work, but I'm going to open it up now for people to share their thoughts and views. I'd be really interested to hear what you guys have got to say about your experiences, what you think the research should focus on. Have you got ideas and thoughts around that could help inform some of the research in the future? What do you think we don't know enough about, or reacting to any of the other things that people have said?
No one's got the hand up yet.
I was expecting a lot of hands to cram in 5 minutes, so
you may have to unmute yourselves, guys.
Is someone trying to speak?
Roberta.
Hello. So I think it would be good to focus on where the barriers are for increasing the political literacy and the engagement for young people coming from different backgrounds, so that you go in more detail of what specific barriers are for different groups of young people, and so that we know more about the best practice that are now happening to address those barriers, and collect from the amazing work done by the youth workers now, what can be done to prevent, to support more and work with young people to increase their political literacy and their voice to be heard.
No, I think that's definitely an important part of it. I think we know that a lot of feedback suggests that most young people don't feel that their political education is sufficient, and they don't feel like they learn enough in school around some of those processes. Thomas, did you have something you want to come in on?
Yeah, just wanted to ask whether the research is going to look at the sort of skills that young people can develop from participation, because obviously the whole process allows them to develop many skills like analysis, confidence, campaigning, and so on. If young people understand what the benefits are, perhaps that can also be a motivator for them getting involved in the first place, if that makes sense. Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. I think, I mean, sometimes there's a difficulty there between not wanting to, sell something on something it's not. So, I mean, but I do think that a lot of the skills that people pick up through participation in terms of finding their voice have massive impacts on things like employability in the future, their ability to communicate and navigate systems that are complicated, to actually problem solve and think about the world around them. I think that's important. I would worry sometimes about solely focusing on that, because you can then lose sight of where you're going and have people participating for the wrong reason. But no, I think that's useful to think about. James?
I think one of the barriers is when we're doing it really well, that it is counterproductive to the people that then want the participation, because when we engage young people completely wholehearted with ownership, they don't need the people that then requested the participation. They then see it as a threat, and then it becomes almost something to suppress. So when young people want to do something or really take ownership, they're told they can't. So we're only kind of allowing it at a certain point, which puts a lot of young people off.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a sense there that sometimes when people come with the idea of saying, "Can you ask the young people what they think?" You almost want to put a bit of word of caution. You might not like what you hear. You know, I do think there's a worry sometimes that we move into a sort of situation where we feel like, I think certainly the youth worker can find themselves in a position there where you're at odds with your employer, where you might be having to articulate something that's going to be very unpopular. Anastasia.
Yeah, sorry, just needed to unmute myself. For me, it's about concepts, and I'll sort of keep bringing the point up around how we perceive of participation and politics, and that for me, it's not something that is separate to generic youth work. It's implicit in it, and you know, part of our duty around as youth workers to work with young people around their participation and political understanding, not just politics with a big P, but politics with a little p, and develop that understanding through good youth work practice around sort of decision making, critical analysis, building those capacities, skills, understanding, and then that sort of wider links to their place in society. So it's that good youth work process from the beginning and not something that's disembodied from it. And I'm really quite passionate about that.
I absolutely massively hard agree with you on that. I think it should run through what we do. I think in good youth work, we are working to support young people to get their voice heard almost constantly. It's one of the reasons I always found quite a challenge as a youth worker when some of the ideas around participation started to come into fashion in wider local authorities, that it felt suddenly something I felt like we'd been doing for a long time, we were now being told to do. Which, you know, you had suddenly senior managers who'd caught on to the idea that we should find out what young people think about this and they need to be involved. And we're asking us to prove how we had young people involved in what were essentially youth-led projects, you know, which becomes very hard to evidence sometimes because the projects are youth-led. We haven't gone out and got them to be youth-led. They've started out that way and developed that way.
But Roy, I think one of the things that we have as youth workers is being frightened to challenge our employers. And the one thing that we've quite often done, we'll do a lot for young people, but what sometimes we don't do for ourselves is take some credit in celebrating the way we work. Yeah. And quite often we become over-evaluated, too much theory, and I think one of the things that youth workers love is that simplicity of the work that we do. And anybody here that's a member of a trade union should know that we're in a risky position. And with the right national wing government we've got, they want to put young people down. Scotland and Wales have just allowed 16-year-olds to vote. So where are we at if we talk about giving a real voice to young people? And I think one of the things we're very frightened of is, and we've been told this now, in schools, you know, you haven't got to talk about capitalism. They want to change history. They want to change everything. But what I've said to some people is, tell them to get stuck. Sorry, I hope that's not a swear word. But
well, I think Terry, that's a good way to round off today with a bit of passion there at the end. And I think it's important for us to hold on to that passion as youth workers. I'm conscious that other people have got other things to do today and going to be needing to move on. So I'm going to close off here. Although what I'd like to say, this isn't the end of the conversation as far as I'm concerned. I'm interested in running more of the workshops that I've already run, that people like Terry and other people have participated in already. If you're interested in taking part in one of those, I'll just put the link in there again for the Microsoft Forms, that you'll be able to find out about the research. You might just want to come in for an interview or be part of it, be part of the main list so you know what's going on. You may want to come and be part of one of the workshops where we're looking at some of these themes in a little bit more detail, and then hopefully going to be picking up on some of those key subjects and then drilling down deeper. It might be that you've got a group of young people who would be really interested in getting involved in some sessions, because I know I'm talking to Terry about that at the moment, about talking to a group. And I've got another worker that I'm linked in with as well around that. And it'd be really good to see their reflections on some of the same questions and find out how do they perceive the work that the youth workers do. So I'd really love to hear from more of you. The other workshops may be a slightly longer, give it a bit more space for discussion. And usually I work in smaller groups of about 8 to 12, so we can have a bit more of an in-depth conversation in those. But it's been really positive to come and talk today. I'm glad looking at some of the comments, people, it's sparked a bit of passion for a few people as well. And I do think it's important that we own our own political views as youth workers, and that our work with young people is there to model some of that behaviour. Not necessarily telling people what to think, but helping them to express the thoughts they're having. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Roy, and just a huge thanks to all of our colleagues as well for taking the time to come together. So I really do appreciate that, and I really hope that we get the opportunity to do more of these in conversations as well. So please get in touch with us, myself, or Kev's on here, and so is Laura. So please get in touch if you feel like this would be of benefit to do more of these in conversations, and please support Roy and, you know, be part of his research. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a pleasant Thursday evening.